I'm 34 now, and I've kept this secret for 7 years. Not because I enjoy the mystery, not because I want to feel special, but because the kind of truth I'm about to confess doesn't stay gentle once the world gets its hands on it. People don't protect what they don't understand. They either worship it, weaponize it, or turn it into a headline. And in a place like the White Valley, where the cold can erase footsteps in minutes and silence can swallow screams before they exist, attention is more dangerous than any storm. So I'm going to do the one thing I promised myself I'd never do. I'm going to tell you how it all happened, how I found him, how I broke protocol, how I made a choice that cost me my career, my peace, and the normal life I thought I'd eventually return to, and how the worst didn't happen as some dramatic attack like people imagine. It happened as a decision I never should have been forced to make. Before that day, I was Isla, young researcher, field guide, the kind of person who learned early that the world isn't impressed by your fear. I worked where maps looked unfinished and the horizon felt too clean, guiding small scientific teams through extreme environments. I didn't mind isolation. In fact, I preferred it. Out there, you don't waste energy pretending. You either respect the conditions or they correct you. The cold doesn't care what you believe. The wind doesn't care how brave you sound. You learn humility fast or you learn it the hard way. White Valley was the hardest place I'd ever set foot. A basin of ice and stone so cold that gear behaves like it's tired, and your own breath feels like something sharp. At 71 degree Celsius, everything becomes a negotiation. Movement, oxygen, time. You don't linger. You don't improvise. You don't make emotional decisions. You follow protocol because protocol is what keeps you alive when your body starts making stupid bargains just to feel warm. Again, that morning I was supposed to do something simple. A short survey route, check a series of old markers, verify the stability of a nearby ice shelf, then return to camp. Clean, boring, efficient. We were operating near hookup points from an abandoned research outpost. One of those places governments build with big dreams and then quietly leave behind when the funding dries up. The plan was to use the old structure as a windbreak if the weather shifted, nothing more. Then I saw the fissure, a narrow split in the ice that hadn't been there in the previous satellite pass, or at least hadn't been visible. The surface around it looked wrong, subtle sagging. Powder drifted in a way that suggested heat movement underneath. My first thought was structural risk. My second thought was that I shouldn't be anywhere near it. But curiosity is a quiet trait in scientists. It doesn't shout, it just leans forward. I approached slowly, testing each step, listening for that hollow sound that warns you the ice is thinner than it looks. I remember the wind easing for a moment, like even the valley was watching. And then I noticed the shape near the edge of the fissure. A darker lump against the snow, half sheltered by a ridge of wind-packed ice. At first, I thought it was debris, a chunk of gear lost in an earlier expedition, a pack, a tarp. Then it moved, not fast, not like an animal trying to escape, just a small shift, enough to tell me it was alive and weak. I knelt at a safe distance, heart hammering hard enough that I felt it in my teeth, and I saw him clearly. A cub, not human, not bear, not anything my training could neatly label, covered in frost-crusted fur, curled tight in a posture that screamed exhaustion, and yet his eyes were open, dark, focused, not glazed over, watching me with an expression I can only describe as asking. That was the moment my brain tried to save me with denial. It can't be what you think it is. Because if it was, then everything I knew about the world would become optional. If it was, then the stories people laugh at around heaters and campfires had just crawled out of myth and into my hands. He didn't snarl, he didn't bare teeth, he didn't even try to crawl away. He just stared at me like I was the last warm thing left on Earth. I looked around, scanning the snowfield, expecting to see movement. An adult nearby. Some sign that I was about to be confronted by something protective. But the valley was blank, just white and wind, and the distant slow groan of shifting ice. My radio hissed softly at my shoulder. I could have called it in. I could have said, unknown mammal, possible endangered species, request extraction. I could have done what a responsible professional does, but I didn't, because in that first minute, a cold, clear truth settled into me. If I reported it, people would come fast. They'd come with equipment and cameras and a mission. They'd come with the kind of excitement that pretends to be concern. And this cub, this impossible, quiet creature that had not chosen me, but had somehow been placed in my path, would become an object, a specimen, a problem to solve. And I could already see the ending of that story, so I made the choice that rewrote my life. I opened my thermal shelter bag, an emergency cocoon designed for human survival, and I moved toward him slowly, making myself small, speaking softly even though he couldn't possibly know my words. I expected him to bolt, to panic, to fight, but he didn't. His body trembled once, not in aggression, but in weakness. When I slid the shelter open and created a pocket of warmer air, he leaned into it like he understood exactly what it was. I lifted him, careful, steady, feeling the lightness that terrified me because it meant he'd been losing the fight for a while, and I tucked him into the thermal lining against my own core temperature. His fur was cold as stone at first. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, it stopped feeling like ice and started feeling like something that belonged to life again. Every alarm bell in my training screamed at me: contamination, disease risk, unknown species handling, violating field protocol, endangering myself, endangering the mission. But I couldn't put him back, not after he'd looked at me like that. I turned away from the fissure and headed for the abandoned outpost, moving faster than I should have, the cub hidden beneath my outer layers and inside the shelter bag like contraband. The wind rose again and tried to punish me for my decision. The cold bit harder. My eyelashes froze. My gloves stiffened. The world narrowed to a tunnel of white and my own breath inside my mask. I reached the outpost with my legs shaking, forced the old door open with a shoulder, and got inside. The building smelled like metal and dust and forgotten plans. The power was dead. The corners were filled with old crates and torn insulation. But it was a roof, and in White Valley, a roof is mercy. I sealed the door, layered emergency insulation across the worst gaps, and created a small, safe pocket of warmth using my compact heater and heat packs. Careful not to overload anything, careful not to create a plume of heat that could be seen from far away. I laid the cub on folded fabric, kept him inside the thermal cocoon, and watched his breathing, counting the rise and fall like it was a prayer. That first night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a wall and listened to the valley outside, waiting for consequences, waiting for footsteps, waiting for something larger to come looking for him, waiting for my radio to crackle with someone asking why I hadn't checked in on schedule. At some point, the cub opened his eyes fully and looked straight at me, not frantic, not fearful, aware. And in that moment, I felt something I still struggle to admit, the sense that I wasn't simply rescuing him. I was being chosen. The next morning, I checked the weather window and realized the storm pattern had shifted. Our team's schedule would change. More people would pass near the outpost. The risk of discovery was no longer theoretical. It was counting down. I stared at the door, at the frost creeping along the edges, at the cub's chest rising a little steadier now, and I understood the trap I'd walked into. Saving him had been the easy part. Keeping him hidden would be the life-altering part. And that was when the first real threat appeared. Not claws, not teeth, not anything dramatic, but something far worse in a place like this. A low mechanical hum outside, faint but growing, like distant machinery fighting the cold. I froze, listening, because in White Valley, nothing mechanical moves by accident, and whatever was out there, it was getting closer. The hum outside didn't become a roar, and that's what made it terrifying. It stayed low and steady, the kind of sound that means something is moving with purpose, not chaos. Equipment, rotors, a drone, a generator sled, anything built to survive the cold. I killed my heater immediately and wrapped the cub tighter inside the thermal cocoon, pressing him close to my core so the outpost wouldn't leak a bright heat signature into the valley air. The silence that followed felt thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. I moved to the cracked window and stared through frost-smeared glass, trying to see without being seen. For long minutes, I saw nothing but blowing powder and the pale curve of the horizon. Then the sound drifted away, as if whatever was out there had changed course. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even make myself relax. I just sat back against the wall, shaking in a way that wasn't only cold, because the first lesson of my new life had arrived fully, formed. In a place this extreme, danger doesn't always look like a predator. Sometimes it looks like attention passing nearby, close enough to change everything. The cub made it through that night, and that, in itself, felt impossible. His breathing steadied in small increments, like he was climbing back toward the world one careful step at a time. I gave him warmed water in tiny amounts, watched for signs of distress, and did everything I could with what little I had, improvising without crossing the line into recklessness. When he finally accepted food, soft, carefully warmed rations, he didn't devour it like something starving. He ate with control, then looked at me as if he was evaluating the exchange. That look stayed with me. It wasn't the blank stare of an animal. It was the look of a mind collecting information. Even then, even weak, he was learning. I named him Coda without thinking too hard about it, because giving a being a name is the first step toward admitting they matter. I told myself it was practical, something to call him in my notes if I needed to, but it wasn't. It was my heart quietly choosing a side. And the moment that name existed, my entire mission shifted from temporary rescue into something more dangerous, protection. The weeks that followed were the strangest kind of normal. Outside, White Valley did what it always did. Winds carving the surface, ice groaning in the distance, daylight flattening everything into endless white. Inside the abandoned outpost, Coda grew stronger, and the faster he recovered, the more I realized I was not dealing with a fragile animal barely holding on. I was dealing with intelligence moving back into a body. He started watching my hands, then my face, then my routines. He learned what my movements meant before I realized they had meaning. If I reached for my gloves, he shifted away from the draft. If I checked the door seals, he moved toward the warmest corner without being guided. If I hesitated near the heater, he stared at it like he was trying to understand the concept of fire without touching it. It wasn't magic. It was observation, repetition, pattern, learning the way a human child learns, except faster, quieter, and with a seriousness that made me feel like the student. There were moments, small, almost ridiculous moments, that gave me breathing room inside the tension. Once, after watching me struggle to open a frozen latch with stiff gloves, Coda copied my frustration with a soft huff that sounded eerily like exasperation, then placed his hand against the metal in a way that warmed it just enough to loosen the ice. He didn't force it. He didn't break it. He assisted with precision, then looked at me as if to say, "That's how you do it." Another time, when the wind battered the walls so hard the outpost seemed to shiver, he positioned himself between the draft line and where I slept, angling his body like a living windbreak, not smothering me, just reducing the cold bite. It wasn't dramatic heroism. It was care, expressed in practical actions, and it landed on me in a way that made my throat tighten, because it was the kind of care I hadn't known I'd been starving for. But even in the tender moments, the tension never left. Every time I stepped outside, I worried about leaving tracks too obvious. Every time I heard a distant crack of ice, I wondered if it was just the valley breathing or something approaching. I began living by a new set of rules that weren't written in any field manual. Keep the heat low, keep movement minimal, never create a predictable pattern, and never forget that the biggest predator in this story wasn't in the snow. It was in the human urge to own what's rare. I stopped checking in with my team the way I should have. I made excuses about equipment issues. I altered routes. I volunteered for solitary tasks so no one would share my footprints. I became, without realizing it at first, someone who was constantly rehearsing lies, not malicious lies, but protective ones, the kind you tell when the truth would summon a crowd. As Coda grew, the outpost changed too. It stopped feeling like a temporary shelter and started feeling like a hidden home I was trying to keep invisible. His body filled space quickly. The thermal cocoon that had swallowed him whole at first became something he could push out of with ease. His shoulders broadened. His hands became capable in a way that made tools feel less necessary. His eyes held more and more awareness. And with that awareness came something I hadn't anticipated: restlessness. He would pause mid-routine and tilt his head as if listening to something far beyond the walls. He would stare toward the North Ridge for long stretches, breathing slow, like the air itself carried information I couldn't hear. Sometimes he'd press his palm to the floor and stay still, as if reading vibrations. It wasn't fear. It wasn't agitation. It looked like a pull, a distant call that made his body want to move. That was when the question I'd been avoiding started forming its first sharp edge. Where did he come from? I had found him alone near a fissure, but nothing about him felt solitary by nature. He didn't behave like a creature abandoned by chance. He behaved like someone separated from something, waiting for the right moment to reconnect. And as his strength returned, that something seemed to tug on him more insistently, like the valley had begun to remind him he didn't belong inside rusted walls and human insulation. I should have taken that as a sign to let him go immediately, open the door, step aside, trust the world to do what it would do. But there was no safe letting go in White Valley. He was still young. The weather was still brutal. And beyond the cold, there was the human threat closing in, slowly, invisibly. Mining surveys had started creeping toward the region, nothing official enough to make news, but enough to be felt. Distant equipment sounds became more common. Once, in the far distance, I saw a line of moving lights on the horizon, low and steady, like a convoy cutting across the ice. It stayed miles away, but it didn't need to be close to be dangerous. It meant humans were mapping this place, measuring it, assigning it value. And that's when I made the second life-altering choice. I decided I needed proof. Not proof for the internet, not proof for fame, proof as a shield, something that could force the right kind of protection if the wrong kind of people got too close. I told myself that if I had one clean piece of evidence, I could go to a scientific board, an environmental authority, someone with legal power, and say, there is a species here that needs safeguarding, and you need to act quietly before greed turns it into a hunt. I told myself I could control who knew. I told myself I could do it responsibly. Those are the lies good intentions whisper when you're desperate. The first time I tried to record Coda, I did it cautiously. No flash, no broadcast, just a small camera pointed away from windows, capturing a few minutes of him moving, his breathing, his eyes, the undeniable scale of his hands as he lifted a cracked crate like it weighed nothing. Coda noticed immediately. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He simply stared at the lens with a stillness that made my skin prickle, then turned his face away as if he understood what that device meant. Capture, replay, repetition. He looked back at me once, not angry, but disappointed in a way I didn't think a non-human could express. I lowered the camera and felt shame burn through me, because I realized I'd done something subtle but profound. I'd treated him like a subject instead of a being. I promised myself I wouldn't do it again unless it was absolutely necessary. Then the sky betrayed me. I didn't see the drone at first. I felt it. A faint vibration in the air. A mechanical whisper that didn't belong among snow and wind. When I stepped outside to check the outpost's vents, I caught a glimpse of it far off, small, dark against the pale sky, moving in a slow sweep pattern like it was scanning. My stomach dropped. Because this wasn't a random hobby drone. This moved like professional equipment, the kind used for surveying, mapping, thermal detection. And White Valley, for all its emptiness, had started attracting companies that dreamed about what might be under all that ice. I moved fast, but not recklessly. Closed vents, reduced heat output, covered reflective surfaces, minimized the outpost's signature. Inside, Coda had already gone still, head tilted, listening. He wasn't afraid of the cold. He was alert to something else. The drone's path widened, then narrowed, then paused as if it had found an anomaly. Not necessarily us, but close enough to make my blood run cold. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the window, listening for the hum to return, rehearsing what I would do if footsteps appeared. My mind ran through the same question over and over, louder each time. What happens when I'm gone? If I died out here, if I disappeared into this valley like so many names on forgotten maps, what would happen to him? Who would protect him from the next drone, the next survey team, the next wave of human interest that wears a smile while reaching for a cage? By morning, the answer arrived in the worst possible form, a faint signal notification on my satellite device, an automated bulletin circulating among field operators in the region. It wasn't aimed at me specifically, it was general information, but the words made my hands go numb. A mining contractor's drone team had flagged unusual thermal activity near the coordinates of the abandoned outpost zone, and a verification crew would be dispatched to investigate the source. My secret wasn't a secret anymore. Not to the people I feared most, and as I read that bulletin with frost-stiff fingers, Coda stood behind me, silent and tall now, listening to the faint echo of rotors that weren't yet here, but were already on their way. Once the bulletin existed, the White Valley stopped being simply cold. It became watched, and being watched out there is like being hunted, even if no one calls it that. I had less time than I wanted and fewer options than I needed. A verification crew meant people with authority papers, insulated vehicles, thermal readers, and the confidence that comes from believing the landscape is nothing but a resource waiting to be cataloged. They weren't coming to help. They were coming to confirm a signal. And if the signal turned into a rare biological anomaly, it would turn into the kind of story that attracts the worst combination of things: money, ego, and a public that confuses curiosity with entitlement. I tried the simplest solution first: erase the heat. I shut down everything that could produce a thermal bloom. I moved Coda into the coldest inner room and insulated the walls with layers of scavenged material to minimize leakage. I dragged reflective panels away from windows. I buried certain supplies under snow outside so the outpost looked less active. For a few days, it almost worked. The drone hum passed farther away, like it couldn't quite lock onto a consistent source. But the valley is not a place where you can play invisible forever, because even a small human footprint becomes a pattern to anyone determined enough. And Coda was no longer a weak cub curled near a fissure. He was big now, strong, alert, a living thermal engine in a world that reads heat like a map. That was the moment I broke my rule and brought someone else into the secret. Not fully, not recklessly, but enough to survive what was coming. Her name was Dr. Morel Santos, an older researcher from a partner team stationed 2 ridges away. She was the kind of scientist who respected life more than career, and who had once told me, quietly, that ethics are tested in the places no one is watching. I didn't tell her Bigfoot, I didn't need to. I told her the truth that mattered. I'd encountered an unclassified primate-like organism at extreme risk, and a mining contractor had flagged thermal activity that could lead to forced extraction. I asked for one thing only: help me prevent an intrusion until I could relocate the subject safely. Morel didn't ask for sensational details. She asked a question that told me she understood exactly what I was doing. "Is the subject calm around you?" When I said yes, she replied with the heaviest sentence I've ever heard spoken in a measured tone. "Then you're already bonded. That means your first job is not data. Your first job is protection." Morel came alone, under the cover of routine equipment inspection, and the way she handled the outpost made me feel both relieved and ashamed. Relieved because she didn't panic. Ashamed because she saw immediately what I had been avoiding. This couldn't stay here, not even with closures, not even with lies. The outpost was a fixed point, and fixed points are easy to circle. She helped me reinforce a plan that wasn't about confronting the mining crew. It was about making the crew's interest fade. If they found nothing, they would move on. If they found signs of something rare, they would escalate. So we began preparing two things at once: a relocation route for Coda and a decoy narrative for the humans. Coda watched everything. He wasn't frightened of Morel, but he was vigilant. He kept himself between me and the door whenever the wind shifted, like he'd learned that new scents often meant new danger. When Morel tried to lift a hand too quickly to adjust her hood, Coda's posture tightened instantly. Not threatening, not hostile, just ready. I spoke softly, slowed her movements, and Coda eased again. That exchange told me more than any measurement could. Coda understood intent. He understood suddenness. He understood the difference between calm and chaos. And as the pressure outside increased, Coda's own behavior changed in ways that felt like the valley pulling him toward a decision he'd been building for months. He would pause and listen toward the tree line even when the wind was loud. He would press his palm to the ground and stay still until the vibration passed. Once, in the dark hours, he rose from where he rested and stood at the cracked window for a long time, staring into white emptiness as if someone was standing out there calling him without sound. The verification crew arrived quietly, exactly as Morel predicted. Not a dramatic convoy, not a loud invasion, but a patient encroachment. We saw their lights far off through the white, then lost them behind a ridge, then heard the faintest distant clinks of metal. They were careful, professional. That was the problem. They didn't need to run or shout. They just needed to record enough data to justify returning with more authority. We couldn't let them get close, and we couldn't fight them in any obvious sense without escalating attention. So we executed the decoy plan the way you execute something in White Valley, with the landscape itself. Morel located a natural avalanche zone above the outpost slope, an area where wind-loaded snow commonly releases after pressure changes. We didn't cause it. We didn't trigger anything unnatural. We simply prepared our exit and waited for the valley to do what it often does when the weather shifts. The plan wasn't to create a disaster. It was to let nature provide a believable reason that the outpost became inaccessible. If the crew saw a fresh slide, they'd mark the area as hazardous. They'd be forced to back off, and the anomaly they'd been chasing would dissolve into the most boring conclusion of all: false reading, shifting ice, geothermal pocket, equipment error. But waiting for nature to cooperate is a gamble, and gambling in White Valley is how people disappear. The day before the weather shift was supposed to hit, the drone returned, closer. It hovered too long near the outpost ridge, searching with mechanical patience. Coda tensed so hard I thought he might bolt, and if he bolted, everything would unravel. I remember whispering his name, not as a command, but as an anchor, and he looked at me with that deep, steady gaze that always made my stomach drop. Then he did something that still feels like the purest form of connection I've ever experienced. He stepped closer to me and positioned himself so his body blocked the window line. He wasn't hiding behind me. He was hiding me behind him, as if he understood that if the humans found me, they would find him. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was practical, protective, and it broke something open inside my chest because it told me the bond wasn't one-sided. I had saved him once, yes, but he had been saving me too, in the only way he knew, by keeping me alive long enough to make the right choice. That night, Morel and I prepared the last pieces. We packed supplies into insulated sled bags. We sealed the notebook pages Morel had helped me transcribe. Yes, there were pages by then, because I had begun documenting not to expose him, but to preserve the truth if something happened to me. We planned a route toward the tree line where the valley's harshness softened, where natural cover increased, where Coda's restlessness might finally resolve into reunion. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it. Coda wasn't just anxious. He was being called home. And then the pressure became personal. A member of the verification crew approached within sight range of the outpost, stopping on the ridge with a thermal scanner. We could see the silhouette through the frosted window. We could see the device tilt, pause, tilt again, as if it had found a reading that didn't match any expected pattern. My throat closed. Morel's face went still in that professional way that means panic is happening underneath the surface. Coda went motionless, the kind of stillness that isn't fear, it's control. He listened. He waited. And I understood in that moment how thin the line truly was. One confirmed scan, one flagged temperature signature, one biological heat source recorded in a report, and this would stop being my secret and become a corporate problem to solve. Nothing exploded. No one burst through the door. No violence arrived to punctuate the moment cleanly. Instead, the worst kind of tension arrived. The slow certainty that we were minutes away from being discovered without even realizing it. That's when the weather shifted. The wind rose and changed direction in a way you can feel in your bones. The temperature dropped further. Snow began to move like a living thing, sliding sideways in sheets. The ridge above the outpost creaked with weight. Morel looked at me once, and I didn't need her to say it. The valley was about to release pressure the way it always does. We moved. Not rushing like panicked people, moving with deliberate urgency, like we'd rehearsed it because we had. Coda carried more than I expected. Sled bags, insulated packs, sections of old paneling we used to cover tracks. He didn't struggle. He didn't complain. He moved like this was what his body had been built for. When the first heavy gust hit, the sound wasn't a crash. It was a deep, rolling exhale from the mountain. Snow began to slide on the far slope, a natural release that gathered speed and volume, and in the gray-white chaos, the outpost disappeared behind a curtain of moving powder. We did not trigger it. We did not cause harm. We simply used the moment nature gave us. Behind us, the landscape rewrote itself. Ahead of us, the world narrowed into a corridor of trees, dark branches like fingers reaching out of the snow. And that's when I understood what the worst was going to be. Not the crew, not the drone, not the cold. The worst was the choice we were about to make next. To save Coda, I would have to make the world believe he was gone. I would have to cut off the story at its most tempting point, right where curiosity would hunger hardest, so that hunger would starve rather than escalate. As we pushed into the tree line and the wind swallowed the last sound of the outpost behind us, I felt my normal life, my career, my reputation, my future, fall away like old skin. And I realized the ending I wanted, truth, protection, peace, was no longer available. Only a trade, only a sacrifice. The forest at the edge of White Valley didn't feel warm, not really. It just felt less hostile, like the world had finally stopped trying to cut you in half with wind. The trees held the snow differently there. The branches broke the gusts. The ground wasn't one endless reflective sheet that gave drones an easy view. It was textured, shadowed, full of places to vanish. That should have made me feel safe. Instead, It made me realize how long Coda had been living in a landscape that offered him nowhere to hide except distance and silence. We moved for hours in that gray, side-lit day, staying low, threading through natural corridors Morel recognized from old terrain models. We didn't talk much. Talking wastes heat and creates rhythm, and rhythm becomes a trail. I kept glancing at Coda the way you glance at a compass you don't fully trust, because he wasn't following me anymore. He was leading without meaning to. Every time he paused, his head tilted as if the air itself carried instructions. Every time he chose a direction, it was with a quiet certainty that made my chest ache, because it told me he'd been feeling this pull long before I'd admitted it was real. Behind us, the valley made its own decision. The avalanche zone released fully, natural, heavy, indifferent. White Valley does that sometimes when wind loads the slopes and the temperature shifts hard. It wasn't a clean event, not something you film with dramatic music. It was simply the landscape rearranging itself, closing a door without asking permission. Morel and I didn't celebrate it. We used it. We needed it to become the official reason the outpost was now hazardous and unapproachable. We needed it to swallow the coordinates into a story that bored people, because boredom is a shield and excitement is a beacon. By the time the verification crew backed off, the story they carried was already forming. Unstable structure, fresh slide, unsafe approach, thermal anomaly, likely caused by shifting ice and equipment interference. They would file it, move on, and come back later, only if something reignited their interest. My job was to make sure nothing ever did. That was the moment the worst happened. Not as panic, not as anything violent or graphic, but as a choice that made me feel like I was splitting in two. To save Coda, I had to let the world mourn him. I had to make them believe there was nothing left to chase. Morel helped me think like a system. Systems don't respond to feelings. They respond to documentation. So we gave the system the most convincing story it could accept. The outpost was compromised, access was dangerous, and the supposed heat signature was inconsistent and now gone. We left behind just enough harmless debris, broken insulation, an empty heat pack wrapper, a collapsed panel, to support the narrative that whatever anomaly had been detected was either equipment error or temporary geothermal movement. Nothing that pointed to a living being, nothing that invited follow-up. And I made the hardest part official inside myself. I would not try to prove Coda existed. Not ever. Proof would become pursuit, and pursuit would become a cage. The incomplete video I'd recorded, the few minutes of motion, the scale of his hands, the undeniable presence, became my most dangerous possession. I could have destroyed it. I should have destroyed it. But something in me refused, because the truth mattered, even if it couldn't be broadcast. So I did the only compromise I could live with. I cut it down to something that revealed almost nothing. No windows, no landmarks, no audio cues, just a short, blurred fragment of life that could be explained away by skeptics and would be useless to hunters. Then I buried the original in a place no one would ever look, sealed, wrapped, and hidden under layers of mundane field data like it was just another boring archive, a truth disguised as paperwork. When the immediate danger faded behind us, Coda slowed. The frantic urgency that had carried him through the escape softened into something else, focused anticipation. He led us to a thin line of trees where the snow lay differently, less scoured by wind, and the light filtered through branches in a way that felt almost gentle compared to the valley's glare. He stopped there and stood very still, breathing slow, as if he was listening for a rhythm only he could hear. Morel looked at me once. No words, just the silent understanding that her part was ending. She was a scientist, but she had chosen protection over discovery, and now she would return to her life with a weight she couldn't share with anyone. We had arranged it carefully. Her story would be simple: equipment issues, weather shift, abort and relocate. She would never mention Coda. She would never mention me beyond the minimum. Silence would be our shared shelter. Then Coda did something that made my throat close. He turned toward me, and in his eyes I saw the cub I'd lifted from the fissure. Weak, frost-caked, asking without words. But now that asking had changed. It wasn't help me. It was, I'm ready. And beneath that, something like gratitude. Quiet, steady, not dramatic, not sentimental, but unmistakable in its weight. He moved a step closer, then paused, as if giving me the last moment to decide whether I would try to keep him for myself. I didn't. That was the point of everything I'd done. I stepped back. I lowered my hands, palms open, not to command him, but to show him I wasn't going to hold him to my world. I felt tears freeze at the corners of my eyes, and I hated myself for crying because it felt selfish, like I was mourning my own loss more than celebrating his return. But grief and love share the same doorway, and I had walked through it without meaning to. Coda turned his head toward the trees again, and that's when the shadows changed, not in a supernatural way, in a living way. 2 points of darkness appeared between trunks, then 2 more, then several, spaced out still, watching. The kind of stillness that isn't fear but caution, the kind of presence that makes the forest feel suddenly occupied, a family. I didn't see them clearly at first, only the suggestion of bodies larger than mine, fur blending into bark and shadow, eyes reflecting the thin light like deep water. They didn't step forward into the open. They didn't perform. They didn't threaten. They simply observed, quiet guardians of their own secrecy. Coda made a soft sound, not a roar, not anything theatrical. A low, controlled call that felt like a signal. One of the larger shapes shifted, answering with a subtle movement that looked like permission. Coda looked at me one last time, and I swear, in that moment his expression carried a sentence. You did what you could. Now let me go. Then he stepped into the trees, and the shadows accepted him as if he had always belonged there, which he had. The family moved with him, deeper, quieter, and within seconds the forest looked empty again, as if it had never held a secret at all. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, because my body wanted to follow, and my mind knew that following was the fastest way to turn a reunion into a chase. Morel touched my arm once, a brief, grounding pressure, then turned away without ceremony, heading back toward our route. I watched her go, then turned toward the line of trees where Coda had vanished, and I whispered his name into the snow like it might keep him tethered to my memory. It didn't. The world doesn't give you that kind of comfort. The following months were the real punishment. Not the cold, not the drones. The silence afterward. The way I had to return to ordinary life, carrying something extraordinary and pretending it had never happened. I left that research contract. I stopped taking certain assignments. I avoided conferences. I stopped talking about White Valley entirely. People assumed I'd burned out, and maybe I had, but it wasn't exhaustion. It was grief mixed with duty. I had made the world believe Coda was gone, and I had to live inside that lie to keep him safe. Every now and then I'd wake up convinced I'd hear rotors outside my cabin. I'd step into the snow and stare at the tree line, half expecting to see headlights or official jackets. The fear didn't vanish. It just settled into a permanent shape, like a scar you learn to dress around. Then, in late spring, long after the valley's story had cooled and the crews had moved on, I came home to find a small box on my porch. No return address, no note. Just a plain container sealed against moisture, sitting in fresh snow as if it had been placed there carefully, respectfully, without haste. My hands shook as I carried it inside. I opened it slowly, expecting anything. Proof, threat, prank, nothing. Inside was a strip of fabric. My fabric. The piece of cloth I used to wrap around my wrist under my glove, a habit from field work to prevent chafing. It had a small tear in the corner I recognized immediately. I hadn't left it anywhere I could remember. I'd assumed I'd lost it weeks earlier, and yet it was there, clean and dry, folded carefully like someone understood that objects can be messages. I stepped to the window without thinking, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it outside my cabin, a single massive print pressed into the snow near the porch, deep and deliberate. Not a trail, not multiple tracks leading away, just one imprint, as if whoever made it wanted me to see it clearly and then stop looking. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a reminder, a thank you written in the only language White Valley had ever demanded, signs that vanish unless you pay attention. I stood there staring at that print until the light changed. Then I went outside and looked more closely. The edges were crisp, the depth unmistakable, and there were no other marks around it. Whoever did it had approached with care and left with care, minimizing traces, controlling the story even in the snow. That alone told me everything. Coda was alive, and he had learned too well what humans do when they're given a trail. I never told the authorities. I never told the internet. I didn't even tell most of the people I'd worked with. Morel and I exchanged one glance months later at a quiet meeting. No words, just mutual understanding, and we never spoke about it again, because the secret wasn't ours to spend. It was theirs to keep. Now, years later, I'm confessing because I can feel time doing what it always does, pulling everything toward an ending. And I don't want this truth to disappear completely when I do. Not the coordinates, not the proof, just the lesson. The worst that happened wasn't an attack. It wasn't a monster story. The worst was that I learned how quickly good intentions turn into cages, how easily rescue becomes ownership, and how thin the line is between protection and harm when humans decide they're entitled to what they've discovered. Coda grew up, and the world came looking, not with open cruelty, but with smiling interest and paperwork and machines that don't understand tenderness. And I had to do the only thing that would save him. I had to let the world think it had lost him. I keep the wrist cloth in a tin box now, wrapped the same way I wrapped his first shelter, sealed against moisture, protected against time, treated like something sacred without calling it that. And when the nights get too quiet, I take it out and hold it. And I remember the look in his eyes at the edge of the trees, an impossible goodbye that felt like gratitude. Sometimes, when snow falls just right, I swear I can still feel White Valley's silence in my bones. And I know, absolutely know, that somewhere beyond the places humans measure and name, Coda is living, the life I chose for him, free, hidden, remembering.